Hello, my name is Lisa Singh. I will be presenting Module 8, the benchmark module for RSH 912. That is the introduction to the dissertation over at Aspen University. The professor is Dr. Grant. Dr. Grant, I thank you so much for all of your feedback. You really helped me to understand a lot of these difficult concepts with research. You demystified it for me, and I thank you. I thank you. So what I'll be doing is presenting the final defense for a dissertation developed by Priya Boganker in 2012. The title of that dissertation is The Impact of Brief Meditation Training on Stress, Distress, and Quality of Life for Homeless Adults. All right, so I'll begin with her introduction. And one of the first things that I noticed that the Boganker did was she touched on the purpose of the study with her opening sentence in the introduction. And I'll quote it: "A growing body of empirical literature suggests that meditation training can effectively reduce stress, improve regulation of psychological distress, and improve subjective well-being and quality of life." So those would be the variables that she discusses, that she explores in her dissertation. She introduces recent articles that supported the use in the general public, those with psychological conditions, those with substance abuse disorders, and she continues presenting articles that support the use of the intervention with those with a history of abuse and those experiencing acute PTSD, those who have been incarcerated, and those who are experiencing mass disasters. Boganker then goes into a discussion about the homeless population, really giving a definition of what homelessness is. And she says that that is spent a night in an emergency shelter or transitional housing program. Other authors expand on that definition to include more than 30 days, while others say that, it just takes one night for someone to be homeless and they should be labeled as homeless because the matter doesn't improve. Historically, it has not improved after that one night of homelessness. The Boganker then goes on to identify the gap. She's very clear with identifying this gap, and I'll quote her: "Though stress and coping are perhaps one of the most widely studied subjects in psychology, there appears to be a gap in the literature around the potential for stress reduction training programs to be of benefit to the homeless adults." That's her identification of the gap. She then goes on to introduce and expounds upon the actual meditation training. She identifies it as integrative restoration yoga nidra. It is based in yoga. It is a meditation practice that integrates receptive awareness, witnessing, intention, breath awareness, body scan, and relaxation. Very interesting here. Boganker notes that though it was developed in India, it has been quote unquote westernized for use in the Western world. Boganker then presents arguments for the use of the intervention. She notes that the psychotherapy today can be augmented with this intervention. She notes that the psychotherapy isn't enough for those experiencing homelessness. She notes the feasibility of it. She really supports the feasibility. She gives 3 reasons for the feasibility. It's easy to use for those who are new to meditation, as the person just sits in a comfortable position and just follows the prompts of the instructor. It's adaptable. It's great. It was a really interesting read that it can be adaptable to a person's religion, their culture, and also their language, and of course their age group, taking into account disabilities as well. It was very interesting. And the third feature that makes it very attractive is that it's cost effective, and it really doesn't take much from administrative support to run, classes in the IREST. So the author then goes on to note that she couples the prior research and the current data on IREST, and she gives a strong argument that the larger body of research that reflects the benefits of meditation for distress and stress reduction, coupled with the current data on IREST and yoga nidra, it makes a cogent argument to test the potential of the brief IREST meditation training with homeless adults. That's also another direct quote. Okay, now the Bogankar then notes that she's sourcing her research through archival data. All right, so she mentions the Institute of Noetic Sciences. They did research on a brief meditation training in IREST with sheltered homeless adults. Okay, she goes on to say that further studies, so more research was done that included shelter residents who did not participate in the IREST groups. So that's key. And she notes that it was a 3-year data set for the IREST. All right. The purpose of her study is to examine these archival data, so that's that historical data from that project, to examine the effectiveness of the meditation training in reducing stress and psychological distress and in improving quality of life for homeless adults. All right. The author does this by comparing outcome data between those that receive the intervention and those that only receive shelter services. All right. Bogankar then presents a hypothesis, and it is IREST Nidra Yoga will prove effective as a brief meditation training to reduce stress and psychological distress and improve quality of life for homeless adults. All right. So now move on to the methods. All right. Bogankar again introduces that study, the IONS study, and gives the purpose of that study within the method section. So and this is a direct quote, the study utilized archival data. And so she's presenting that she used this data by IONS at Home Within Research Project. So that was the name of the project. It was the result of a collaboration between 2 departments. The purpose of that study was to examine outcomes from a variety of mind-body health classes administered to sheltered residents. And she describes the location, the Mary Isaac Center for the Homeless in California. She also went into detail about the services that the center provides, which are meals, transitional housing, emergency shelter, life skills, and recovery programs for drugs and alcohol. She also notes that the study that she pulled from was conducted from November 2006 to August 2009. All right. Bogankar then goes on to describe the sample. The sample used for that study was 196 homeless adults that were admitted into the Mary Isaac Center. There were 170 study participants that engaged the IREST training, and 79 made up the comparison group. All right. So those 79 did not receive the IREST training. They just received the shelter only services. All right. Bogankar then went on to give the demographics of the sample. She included it in a table, table 5 of her dissertation. She presents the age, race, employment status, and educational background of those that participated in the study. She noted that most, I believe it was more than, it is 63%, more than 63%, were Caucasian. 79% had at least a high school diploma, and so forth. So Boganker then goes on to discuss the prior studies, recruitment, informed consent, data collection procedures. Now with Boganker, with her methods, Boganker was very clear in presenting that she did a quasi-experimental design. All right. So she not only pulled data from that study, the IONS study, but she also pulled qualitative data as well. And those were the interviews. Yeah. So the instruments now that were used, there were 4 instruments that measured stress, life satisfaction, and psychological distress. And these were the perceived stress scale, the positive and negative affect scale, the symptom questionnaire, and quality of life satisfaction scale. All right. Boganker then goes on to describe the instruments. So the perceived stress scale is a self-report of 10 items, and it's a paper survey. All right. And it measures stress perceived by the person, and more specifically, the extent to which the person appraises situations that are stressful. And it's designed to measure how unpredictable and overloaded individuals view these events in their life. All right. The second measure is the positive and negative affect schedule. This was developed to measure two spheres of emotional experience, and that's positive affect and negative affect. Boganker says that her current study utilized an expansion of the positive and negative affect scale. The measure asked participants to rate how often they felt a specific emotion, such as being scared, strong, disgusted, or cheerful. These responses were captured on a 5-point Likert scale. The third measure was yes or no responses, and this was also let me introduce that. The symptom questionnaire. It's a 92-item self-report measure, and the responses would be yes or no. And so the symptom questionnaire, it was an instrument, and it was delineated into 4 distress symptoms. And remember, that was the second variable, the distress, perceived distress. And so this measured somatization, depression, hostility, irritability, and anxiety. For the subscales of well-being, these measured friendliness, somatic well-being, contentment, and relaxation. All right. The fourth measure was the Likert scale, the quality of life satisfaction scale. That was also captured on a Likert scale. It's a self-report inventory. And I just want to mention that the Boganker did mention that self-reporting lent to biased And that was interesting for me. And I think, and in one of the assignments, you made that very clear. Thank you. So this self-report inventory, it measures 6 spheres, all right, and that is recreation, independence, personal development and fulfillment, community, civic, and social participation, relationship with others, and physical well-being. All right. And it's based on evaluations of life satisfaction and functioning. The instrument directs participants to scale their level of current satisfaction with, those life domains, which were recreation, personal development, and fulfillment, and so forth. Again, that was a 7-point Likert scale that captured those responses. And so we move on to the qualitative interviews. These were conducted at the end of the AHW, the IONS study, and those ask questions such as, what do you usually do when you get upset? What are your long-term goals? Very interesting. The results. Now I'll get into a discussion of Boganker's results. So again, the purpose was reintroduced. The purpose of the current study was to compare the outcome data between remember there were 2 samples. So, and there was no randomization. So this was a quasi-experimental design with no randomization. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So she compared the outcome data between those that had received the intervention and those who did not. So those only received shelter-only services. The Boganker went on to discuss the ANOVA, all right, and that this was not a randomized control group. So the data was collected on shelter-only participants to provide some, an outlook of how levels of stress, negative mood, and life satisfaction scores might compare between individuals who did not participate in IREST meditation training to those who did. So because there was no randomization, this was the approach, all right? And so she goes on to say, using a 2-factor univariate analysis of variance, which is the ANOVA. And it was done on the pretest questionnaire information for each dependent variable. So to probe whether or not there were marked differences between the groups. And she notes that the IREST group participants had markedly lower life satisfaction scores on the quality of life satisfaction scale. All right. Now she goes on to a discussion of the treatment and shelter only groups within group comparisons. She used the t-test for this. All right. Further analysis was conducted using paired sample t-tests to understand the nature of within group experience at pre and post test time points. For the shelter only and IREST groups, statistically significant mean differences were detected on quality of life scales, emotional distress, and perceived stress, in the expected trajectory. And it indicated that the whole sample reflected or evinced differences after 4 weeks of the intervention. All right. Then the author reports dividing the IREST and shelter groups to establish if pre and post test scores evinced marked mean differences. Boganker found that the IREST group evinced statistically significant improvement in quality of life and psychological distress and stress. All right, so that was a promising result. For analysis of the shelter-only group, significant differences were noted on anxiety and stress scores, and Bogo-Anker used the t-test to establish the mean differences. Bogo-Anker then goes on to discuss Cohen's D. It used a standardized measure of effect size, and it was calculated for all of the outcomes. All right. When examining the effect sizes, the shelter-only group experienced statistically significant changes on perceived stress and anxiety. All right. Bogo-Anker was also careful to add in this results section that overall the paired sample t-test, and this is a direct quote, evinced that there were statistically significant differences in pre and post-test scores for the combined group after 4 weeks of temporary shelter. All right. Now I will go on to the conclusion. Bogo-Anker reported that the primary goal of her research was to expand the scientific evidence on I-Rest Yoga Nidra and examine whether brief training could reduce stress and distress and improve quality of life in homeless adults compared to shelter and services only. This satisfied the AQUA requirements for the researchers to present the nature of their study, and the authors needs to restate the aim of the research. Key findings presented by Bogo-Anker were related to the significant baseline differences in the treatment and comparisons groups. The primary hypothesis for the study, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. The key findings presented by Bogo-Anker were related to the significant baseline differences in the treatment and comparison groups. The primary hypothesis for the current study could not be tested. The author went on to present that an examination of within-group changes suggested that treatment group participants did experience statistically significant improvements after only 4 to 6 sessions. Results from the study suggested that brief I-Rest training may be effective in reducing negative psychological states and enhancing quality of life for homeless adults experiencing significant distress. She notes that these findings should be interpreted with caution because of the non-randomization that was used. She went on to say that this ideally should be done with a controlled treatment group. And so that concludes the dissertation defense for Bogo-Anker's 2012 dissertation. I know I went a little bit over, but there just was so many things. She had the 3 variables, and those were broken up into, and I just wanted to make it clear why there were 4 measures used. And so most of those measures interlapped. So thank you. This concludes the dissertation defense. Thank you.